Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. We're in the process of planning to resume in-person events. We anticipate this will begin with small, member-only events and activities beginning in the summer. We're so looking forward to seeing you all in person again. But in the meantime, we're going to continue to provide you with a strong lineup of speakers in our live streams. Thank you all for your continued viewership and financial support. For those of you who want to ask Dan a question, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which will start in about 30 minutes. It's now my great pleasure to introduce politics professor Dan Schnur and his program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Kim. Sorry for the delay there. How are you?
So good to see you. You've got three terrific topics as usual. So let me tick those off and hand it over to you. Number one, are Republicans still the party of business? Number two, the US and Iran circle each other on nuclear arms. And thirdly, vaccines versus variants. Is another COVID outbreak coming? Can't wait. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Kim. And thanks, as always, to all of you for joining us for these programs. I always really enjoy them, as I hope you can tell. And the whole team at LA World Affairs Council Town Hall, as you know, does a terrific job on them also. So we're gonna jump right in. And our first topic, as Kim mentioned, is, are Republicans still the party of business? Now, we've seen a flare-up in this long-term relationship that's gone on, that's flourished for many, many years, for decades, between the Republican Party and its business supporters, but primarily because of the controversy over the proposal of new voting laws in Georgia and Texas and in 45 other states around the country. That relationship's being put to a little bit of a test. And so what I'm going to do in just a minute is try to deconstruct this disagreement. But what I want to do first, if you're willing to help me with that, is to ask all of you, thank you, Claire, to answer this first question for me, which might not seem directly related to the topic at hand, but in a minute I'll explain why it is. So this is a question for you personally, putting aside questions about Republicans and Democrats, about business and labor, just a purely personal question about your own political and policy priorities. Which of these three issue areas are the most important to you when you decide who to vote for in an election? Is it economic policy? Is it jobs and taxes, number one? Is it social and cultural issues? Issues like abortion, issues like guns, issues like same-sex marriage and marriage equality? For third, is it foreign and international policy? Of course, the subject matter for which LA World Affairs Council has been primarily known for many years. So let's see what we get from our group here. So this is really interesting, and the results here reflect broader trending in society. 50%, exactly half of our participants today, say that social and cultural issues are their primary motivator for voting, more than economic policy at 39%. And as much as we all closely follow foreign and international policy here at LA World Affairs Council Town Hall, it's less a voting determinant than those domestic policy issues. So that breakdown reflects a change that we've been seeing in American society for quite some time. And what I'd like to do before we get to today's topic directly is offer a little bit of historical perspective on how we got here. So for many, many years, for most of modern history, the most reliable indicator in terms of partisan voting behavior was income. The more money you made, the more likely you were to vote Republican. The less money you made, the more likely you were to vote Democrat. And there's always been exceptions to that over the years, but over many, many decades, through most of the 20th and through most of the 20th century, that was a pretty good rule in being able to determine how most people align politically. And then in the 1990s, Bill Clinton and Dianne Feinstein and a bunch of other very savvy Democrats, they decided that they could actually realize an opportunity with a certain cohort of upper income voters. And for those of you with long memories, you may remember back in the Clinton era, the term soccer moms. And a soccer mom and soccer dad, for that matter, soccer parents, if you will, were upper income voters, economically comfortable, who tended to live in the suburbs. And the term soccer moms came from the idea that these were moms who drove their kids to soccer practice. And some of you may have experienced this either as the driver or as the young soccer player. But back in Clinton's first campaign for president, this group of suburban voters, economically successful, but socially moderate to progressive, became a target of Democrats like Clinton, like Feinstein, and others. And the Clinton message to these soccer parents was, I'm not an old school Democrat. I'm not a tax and spend Democrat. I'm much more fiscally responsible, said Bill Clinton, and therefore I won't threaten your economic comfort. But like you, I'm not comfortable with a more aggressive Republican approach on these social and cultural issues. So why don't you come and vote for me? And as a result, through the 1990s, hundreds of thousands of economically successful, socially moderate to progressive suburban voters began to switch from the Republican to the Democratic Party. Now, the Republican Party didn't take this lying down. George W. Bush and Karl Rove and Newt Gingrich and other Republicans, at the same time that Clinton and his wing of the Democratic Party were reaching out to soccer moms, well, Republicans at the same time began to identify another potential swing voting cohort, which they referred to as NASCAR Dads. Now, I don't know how many of you follow stock car racing, NASCAR and otherwise, but the fans of that particular sport tend to be more economically blue collar, more economically working class, and more socially and culturally conservative. So at the same time that Clinton and the Democrats were moving these soccer moms and soccer parents from the Republican side to the Democratic side, George W. Bush and other Republicans were moving these NASCAR dads, these NASCAR parents, these blue-collar, working-class, socially and culturally conservative voters from Democrat to Republican. And so over the course of a decade or so, the two parties engineered the most massive trade of voters in modern American history, to the point where by the 2004 presidential election, when Bush was reelected over John Kerry, the single most reliable partisan indicator in voting behavior was no longer income. Rather, it had become a measurement called religiosity. And religiosity is not the religion that you practice, but rather the intensity with which you practice it. And so for Americans who attend religious services once a week or more, they're much more likely to vote Republican. And Americans who attend religious services, whether church or synagogue, once a week or less, once a month or less, are much more likely to vote Democratic. And in every presidential election since 2004, through the last 16 years, every year that religiosity differential has become more and more pronounced. And Republicans have become increasingly the party of cultural conservatives, and particularly in the Trump era, of blue-collar cultural conservatives, whereas more and more through the Obama presidency and certainly through the Trump presidency, Democratic ranks began to be made up in increasing numbers of economically successful but socially progressive voters. Now, as I said a moment ago, the Trump era intensified these divisions, with the exception of tax cuts and regulations, in which the Republican Party and the business community are still very much in lockstep. Trump adopted a populist agenda that was largely at odds with the business community and what the business community had expected from Republicans over the years. Trump veered away from Republican policy priorities on trade, on immigration, on deficit reduction. And as the business community began to focus more on climate change and on higher education issues, that caused a greater split as well. But most importantly, what the American business community values more than anything else is stability and predictability. They want to know that their investments are going to be sound. They want to know that the rule of law is going to protect their commercial interests. And while Donald Trump is many things, let's agree that stability and predictability have not necessarily been hallmarks of his professional or political career. The Republican Party began arguing against big tech, against big business. Marco Rubio supported the Amazon union movement in Alabama last week, and there's any number of other examples of Republicans in this post-Trump era taking on more and more pro-worker, anti-business positions. But in appealing to those working class voters, Trump and his followers in the Republican Party began losing their bosses. And now, as I mentioned earlier, we have 47 states that have proposed voting legislation as a result of Trump's complaints about how the 2020 election was administered. Now, as I said before, the business community wants stability. They have a much more diverse customer base than either political party does. And so many of the United States leading businesses, including Coca-Cola, Delta Airlines, American Airlines, Microsoft, and most notably Major League Baseball, have been arguing against these bills. And it's caused a huge rift between the business community and the GOP, leading to all sorts of talk of boycotts, either of boycotting states where this legislation has passed, or alternatively, boycotts of the companies that are arguing against these voting rights bills. But let's examine the question of boycotts a little bit further. And so I'd like to do, Claire, is put up the second question and see how our group feels about boycotts. Would you make purchasing consumer decisions based on a business's position on an important issue? Option one, yes, I will not patronize a business whose owner takes positions with which I disagree. Two, no, I make decisions based on quality and value, not on the politics of the business owner. Or third, it depends on the issue and how strongly I feel about it. Let's see how we come out on this one. Not surprisingly, almost 2/3 of you say it depends. But what's notable is by a more than 2-to-1 margin, our group says that they will not patronize a business whose owner takes positions with which I disagree. And only 11% say that you wouldn't pay attention to that. So really, really important here. And we're seeing once again a trend that reflects the broader trajectory of American consumer behavior. By a 2-to-1 margin, by more than a 2-to-1 margin, our group said these issues are important enough to me that I'll boycott a business if the owner doesn't agree. Now, before we go too far in talking about the split between the Republican Party and the business community, it's worth noting that many of the nation's leading businesses and business organizations are very roundly criticizing the corporate tax increase in President Biden's infrastructure proposal. And in fact, the Business Roundtable started running millions of dollars worth of ads against the corporate tax increase in Biden's infrastructure plan just yesterday. So the bottom line is that the business community is trying to weigh their priorities and decide on which is more important. Their bottom line issues, taxes, regulation, those sort of topics, with broader community-based concerns. And so at this juncture, neither party is a natural home for business anymore. And just like the nature of the post-Trump Republican Party will tell us a lot about American politics more broadly going forward. Whether Republicans follow Trump's path in the future or return to a more traditional conservatism will determine the future of business's role between the two parties. But right now they're in uncharted water, and it'll be very interesting to watch going forward how our nation's business leaders navigate their new sort of in-between role on the American political landscape. Let's move on. We spent a little bit more time on that issue than we normally do on our topics, but I did think that the historical perspective was helpful, and I hope you'd agree with me. But whether you do or not, we'll move on now, and let's talk now about the continued tensions between the United States and the nation of Iran over Iran's nuclear capacity and capability. Now, as all of you know, way back in 2015, the US and Iran, plus the European Union, as well as the so-called P5+1, which is essentially the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, Russia, China, France, Great Britain, and the US, plus Germany. So those countries got together to agree with what became known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, in which Iran agreed to restrict development of its own nuclear capability in exchange for relief from US and UN economic sanctions. Now, 3 years later, in 2018, Donald Trump withdrew the US from that agreement. And since then, 2 things have happened. One, the Iranian economy has been greatly harmed by both reimposed sanctions and new sanctions that the United States has put on Iran. But at the same time, Iran has begun to move forward very aggressively with its nuclear buildup. Now, when Biden ran for president last year, he promised during the campaign that he would re-enter the JCPOA with Iran. But over his first few months in office, his administration has actually been delivering some mixed messages about how much they actually want a new nuclear agreement with Iran. Secretary of State Tony Blinken has alluded frequently to the importance of addressing not only Iran's nuclear capacity, but its non-nuclear weaponry, ballistic missiles and so forth, as well as Iran's support for terrorist activity. And those are all non-starters for Iran's leaders. They simply refuse to talk about ballistic missiles and terrorist activity support. And so the fact that Biden's Secretary of State raises these issues on such a frequent basis makes me wonder if the Biden administration is as invested in a new agreement as the president has said. Now, despite the fact that another example of the curious path that the Biden administration is taking is Iran will hold its next national elections in June, less than 2 months away. And they're almost certain to elect a much more hardline government. But even given that, there doesn't seem to be a lot of urgency from the Biden administration to get a deal done before the June elections in Iran. And after last week's negotiations in Vienna, the message from the US camp about the negotiations was about all the obstacles to getting a deal done, which is not really the way you encourage progress. But before we go any further on why I think the Biden administration is sending out mixed signals about the Iran nuclear agreement, we do want to get your thoughts on this. And it's the very basic question. Should the US re-enter a nuclear agreement with Iran or not? And we're also, rather than just giving you a yes or no, there's a few different options here on both sides to give us a little bit more insight into your thinking on this question. So if you can pick one of these 5 options, say yes, the US should re-enter the nuclear agreement with Iran, should drop sanctions immediately and allow Iran to comply. Yes, we should re-engage, we should get back involved with the agreement, but only after Iran has complied with the original terms and they pull back on the enhancement of their nuclear capacity. And that's the stated position that the Biden administration has. Option 1 is, let's drop the sanctions and get back in. Option 2, Iran needs to act first. They need to comply with the original terms before we drop the sanctions. Or third, yes, we should re-enter that agreement, but only if, as Blinken has alluded to, It also includes provisions on ballistic missiles and on support of terrorism. And then on the no side, you can say, no, I've never supported the agreement to begin with, not in 2015, not in 2018, not now. Or no, I supported the original deal back when the Obama administration came to the agreement with Iran, but I've since changed my mind. So lots of different options here, Claire. What do we get from our group? Wow, how about that? More than 90% of you want to re-enter the negotiations, but there's a very profound split on whether the new agreement should include ballistic missiles and terrorist support in addition to addressing Iran's nuclear capacity as the original deal did. 46 to 39 is a pretty close margin. I think it's very interesting that our group is so split in that regard. Only 7% are against the deal, and only 1% have changed their mind over the last 5-6 years. But on balance, it reminds me of the phrase that Ronald Reagan used when negotiating with Mikhail Gorbachev way back in the day, back in the 1980s, when he utilized the old Russian proverb, trust but verify. Okay, so I wanted to share with you my own theory on why I think the Biden administration is sending out such different signals. In my opinion, these mixed messages make a lot more sense if you believe that Biden is more interested in appearing to negotiate with Iran, as opposed to actually moving forward with those negotiations in any tangible way. And the pretense of progress, in my mind, is a very logical strategy if you believe, as I do, that Biden's primary audience is not in the Middle East, but in Europe, and that his most important foreign policy goals have nothing to do with Iran at all. Let me explain. So earlier this year, and we talked about it on a program a couple months ago, when Biden spoke to the G7, the Group of Seven, and the Munich conference, his emphasis at both of those gatherings of our most stalwart allies his emphasis was almost exclusively about the threat that China and Russia present to the world order. And on one hand, the Europeans were very, very relieved to welcome back a more traditional American partner. They were very notably cooler, much cooler, in response to Biden's call to unite against the menace that he argued is posed by Russia and China. The EU had just signed a very sweeping trade agreement with China, although that agreement might now be in danger. And Germany has been leading an effort to complete a transcontinental export gas pipeline with Russia. So they made it pretty clear that they were not nearly as enthusiastic about taking on China and Russia as the US was. But Biden needs Europe if he is going to stand up or push back to China and Russia. Europe is much more wary about America's reliability after 4 years of dealing with Trump. So Biden's pulling out all the tools at his disposal to rebuild the relationship between the United States and Europe. He can talk a good game on climate change and trade issues, but he's limited by domestic policy matters in this country on both of those issues. And so pledging to fix a broken Iran nuclear agreement, whether he actually wants to or not, may be his best way of reassuring those nervous European leaders that he can be trusted as an ally. But as I said, Biden's words and actions since taking office suggest that the Middle East will be much less of a priority for him than it has been for his predecessors. So if talking a good game on Iran is what he needs to do in order to marshal support from Europe on his more important goals, standing up to China and pushing back on Russia, then maybe a little bit of lip service regarding Iran seems like a reasonable price to pay. Now we'll talk about Russia next week. Biden and Vladimir Putin had a phone call conversation this morning in which Biden suggested a summit between the two of them in a third country. So we have a lot more to talk about there. And we haven't even gotten to the added complication that Israel has thrown into the mix about the Iran negotiations over the weekend. one of Iran's most critical nuclear facilities, as most of you know, was attacked over the weekend and put out of commission for several months. Now, Israel didn't exactly take credit for the attack, but they didn't actually make much of an effort to deny it either. And even if the United States was not directly involved, it's pretty unlikely that the White House didn't know about the attack before it happened. And so what we don't know yet is whether the attack will be an excuse for Iran to either leave the negotiations, which are going to begin again tomorrow in Vienna, or whether it might actually increase the US's leverage by at least by several months delaying Iran's progress on nuclear matters. But ultimately, these kinds of agreements are built on a basis of trust. And when Iran's negotiators won't even meet face-to-face with the Americans even before the attack over the weekend, there's not a lot of trust to go around, either on the US or the Iran side, which makes me think that substantive progress is very unlikely. But what do you think? Do you trust Iran to hold up their end of the deal? Claire, can we put up the next question? Do you trust Iran's leaders to abide by a new agreement? And once again, we've given you a few options here. Not just do you trust them, but why or why not? One, the US broke the, yes, I trust them. The US broke the deal last time under Trump, not Iran. Second, I do trust Iran's leaders because they have so many financial incentives to comply to rebuild their own economy. Third, no, I don't trust them, but we should move forward anyway with the appropriate caution we were talking about earlier. Or no, I don't trust them, and so we shouldn't enter into a new agreement with Iran. And let's see how our numbers came out on this one. Very, very interesting. 70% say, nope, I don't trust Iran, but we need to move forward anyway, as long as we exercise appropriate caution. 10% of you say that the US is responsible because the US broke the deal last time, we can trust them. 15% we can trust them just because they are in such desperate economic straits. But 70%, between 2/3 and 3/4 of you, take that old Russian adage I mentioned earlier to heart. Trust, but verify. Well, finally, we'll spend just a few minutes on the COVID question, and then we'll come back to this in the weeks ahead. Because, of course, it appears that there may, and I underscored the word may, be another surge coming. Now, let's think about, for those of you from out of state, I'll apologize for a moment, but most of our participants are from California, so we'll use that as the jumping off point into the national conversation. So as of Monday, California had a coronavirus test positivity rate of 1.5%. That's the lowest in the nation. Vaccine eligibility will be expanded this week for everyone 16 and older. But along with the promising news comes some more discouraging numbers. Our state's vaccine supply was already set to shrink 15% this week and another 5% next week because of the Johnson & Johnson manufacturing mix-up. And because some of those doses reserved for Californians getting their second shot of the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine, the number of available first shots is going to drop by a full 1/3 this week and another 4 or 5% next week. And that was before this morning's news that Johnson & Johnson will be temporarily pausing the distribution of their vaccine because of health issues that have emerged, I should stress, with a very small number of recipients. So in the middle of all this good news, but also cautionary news, last week, Governor Newsom announced that he will eliminate the 4-tier color-coded reopening system that the state's been using for several months. And as of June 15th, he intends to fully reopen the state's economy. So the question for you is whether we're ready for that step or not. What do you think? Should California be reopening? Or should we be given, and especially, we haven't talked yet about what's going on in Michigan and other states, should California prepare to be reopened, particularly given COVID outbreaks in other parts of the country? Yes, we should be reopening. Vaccines offer enough protection for us. Yes, we should be reopening. but at just partial capacity, more carefully and more cautiously until the threats in other states pass. Or third, no, we shouldn't be reopening yet. And Newsom's acting too quickly. We need to wait for further steps, to take further steps until the threats in other states have passed. 3/4 of you say that we should reopen, but only partially, not as aggressively as Newsom has suggested, given the threats from other states and presumably the vaccine shortage. So once again, very interesting responses from all of you. So a couple of quick points on this before we go to your questions. So the question referenced what's going on in other states. And as I think many of you know, in New York, New Jersey, in Florida, in Pennsylvania, and most worrisome in Michigan, there have been real surges of the virus, of variants of the virus. In Michigan, the state is averaging 7 times the number of cases they were just 6 weeks ago in late February. And you may have seen on the news that Governor Gretchen Whitmer is begging the Biden administration for more vaccines. And just yesterday, Biden's Center for Disease Control has begun urging Whitmer to temporarily shut things down in her state. Now, the one thing we learned last spring is that the virus doesn't respect state borders. So essentially, we're watching a race now, a race between the distribution of vaccines and the spread of new variants of the coronavirus. The more people vaccinated, the better protected we are from new strains of COVID emerging. But we're seeing resistance in many minority communities and among very large numbers of Trump supporters, people who don't trust the vaccine and who are not taking it, which is complicating matters tremendously as new variants emerge. Now, this is not meant, I do not mean for a moment to sound alarmist. We've made tremendous progress, and we as a country are much safer now than at any time in the last 14 months. And even with the Johnson & Johnson suspension this morning, with Pfizer and Moderna alone, the US is still going to be on track to hit 3 million shots a day and 200 million doses within Biden's first 100 days in office, exceeding his original promises. The pause isn't likely to last long. CDC officials predicted this morning. And just for some perspective, finally, on the Johnson & Johnson shutdown, the reason for the suspension is that they have found 6 cases of blood clots among those taking that particular vaccine. And that's alarming and that's frightening. And I believe that the state and national government are doing the right thing by temporarily suspending the Johnson & Johnson vaccine until more research can be done. But I do want to put this in perspective. 1 in every 1.1 million people who received the Johnson & Johnson vaccine suffered these side effects, 1 in every 1.1 million. And by way of comparison, every year about 12 in every 100,000 Americans dies in a car crash. So there is a 20 times greater likelihood of an individual perishing in a car accident than they are to suffer the side effects of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be careful, but let's not overreact to it either. But what all this tells me, at least, is we still do need to be careful. And from the results of the last poll question, you feel the same way. And what that means is continuing to wear masks and abide by other types of social distancing for the foreseeable future. All right, Jessica, on that happy note, let's open up the conversation. And if you're willing to rejoin me here, maybe we can get to what I think you know is my favorite part of the program, is questions from our participants.
Thank you, Dan. The first question, this pertains to the first poll question that was asked: where does climate change fit in with those 3 issues? It affects all: economic, cultural, and international relations.
Well, it's a great question, and I would probably put it in the context of of economic issues, because while it is a global problem, there are obviously US-based steps that need to be taken in terms of public policy and governance in order to successfully confront the climate change challenge. Of course, it has social and cultural implications as well, but traditionally that terminology has been used to talk about issues like abortion, like guns, like same-sex marriage and marriage equality. So the questioner is exactly right. It's not a perfect fit because it affects all three of those areas, but for the purposes of our discussion, I would frame it not exclusively, but at least first as an economic matter.
Do you believe that Biden being pro-union and jobs has caused Republicans to rethink how they approach blue-collar workers?
I don't think so. I feel like the Trump wing of the Republican Party has so aggressively reached out to blue-collar workers and seen potential union-based opportunities to build political support from organized labor, that even though that support's not going to come from formal labor organizations, from the AFL-CIO, from the Service Employees Union, from the Teachers Union, that enough union members crossed over to vote for Trump. But I think they see opportunities there. And while Biden is pushing more aggressively to secure labor support than perhaps Obama did during his term, stylistically and substantively, I don't know that Biden's approach has caused Republicans to rethink what they're doing. And in fact, many leading Republican thinkers believe that working class voters will represent the future of the party. As more and more economically successful, socially moderate and progressive voters switch to the Democratic Party, many Republicans see this working class cohort as their natural base in the future. So they're certainly aware that Biden is making a more sustained effort on this front, but I don't think it's altered their approach.
Do you think big businesses' love of stability explain their accommodation of China, which seems to lessen the credibility of its wokeness?
Yes, absolutely. Most businesses, who participate in the international marketplace, recognize the obvious, that China's sheer size presents incredible consumer opportunities. And we've seen businesses in almost every sector very aggressively pursue those opportunities. And it is notable, as the questioner I think was implying, that taking on the state of Georgia is much less potentially economically damaging for many businesses than sacrificing an opportunity to continue to reach out to the Chinese marketplace. And so as we get closer, as the debate over whether or not the US should boycott the Beijing Olympic Games next year continues to heat up, we'll see the American business community and business leaders all over the world put in an increasingly difficult position of having to choose between their support for human rights and their interest in continuing to take advantage of opportunities in the Chinese marketplace. So very, very tricky path ahead on China for business in America and elsewhere. Georgia might have been a little bit easier call in that regard.
In the past, has a boycott ever put a company out of business, and which business?
Boy, it's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. I do know that when we think about international boycotts, that you can make a very strong and sustained case that the US-led boycott of South Africa in the 20th century played a direct role to the end of apartheid. On the other hand, you can also make a strong case that the US boycott of Cuba, while damaging that nation's economy in all sorts of ways over the decades, has done very little, if anything, to change the Cuban leadership's behavior as it relates to the US and the rest of the world. We don't have a good answer on that one. Can we just move on?
Sure. How do you foresee the Biden administration leveraging its regional allies in the Middle East to reduce Iran's growing power in the region?
Well, as we've talked about on this program before, I actually don't think the Biden administration is all that invested in the Middle East. They're participating in the Iran nuclear negotiations because while they wouldn't mind a deal, it's less of a priority than reassuring Europe and convincing them to be more stalwart allies on Russia and China. And we're already beginning to see signs of success on that front. Several European nations and the EU imposed sanctions over China's human rights abuses, imposed sanctions on many Chinese government officials. And that's something they probably would not have been willing to do, even just a few months ago, back in January, when Biden took office. I believe the Biden administration will continue to try to move forward on the Abraham Accords and the subsequent diplomatic efforts that have that have normalized relationships between Israel and several of the Arab Gulf states. But I don't see Biden's administration playing a particularly active role beyond encouraging progress on that front. And it's become very clear that Biden, unlike his predecessors of both parties, does not seem particularly interested in investing much, if any, of his political capital in trying to achieve a resolution to the Israel-Palestinian challenge. So the Biden administration will certainly make sure we're represented in the region, but I don't see it as nearly as high priority for them as it has been for presidents in the past. Biden's focus is on the Pacific Rim and China, and if good things are potentially going to happen in the Middle East, he'll encourage them forward. If a real crisis emerges, he'll of course be forced to address that. But barring anything of immense importance happening in an unexpected way, I don't think we'll see a very visible Biden presence in that part of the world for the foreseeable future.
Assuming Israel was responsible for the Natanz attack, do you believe this was intended as a form of protest against the U.S. rejoining the JCPOA? And do you believe that the U.S. supported or opposed this attack? And one other questioner asked, could Israel sabotage the Iran nuclear center without the U.S. knowing about it?
So I'll take those in reverse order. While I think it's possible for Israel to have engaged in this kind of activity without the U.S. knowing about it, I think it's very, very unlikely. Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, very noticeably did not answer that question when it was put to her yesterday on whether the U.S. knew about it or not. But to take on the broader issue, I'd offer a couple thoughts. One, there's an immense difference between the way the Biden administration and the Obama administration are proceeding on these Iran nuclear talks as it relates to Israel. As angry as Israeli leaders were that Obama entered into that agreement with Iran, they were just as angry that they felt that the White House had lied to them about those secret conversations. Biden's administration has already made it very clear to Israel that while the U.S. intends to move forward with negotiations with Iran, that they're going to be completely open and honest with Israel about it. And so even though there's a fundamental disagreement at the core about whether this agreement should be made or not between Biden and Israel's leadership, I don't think the animosity will be nearly as much, just because the more upfront approach that Biden is taking is going to yield some benefits. Israel is fiercely opposed to the agreement. The last point I'll make on this, though, relates to Israeli domestic politics, which we talked about on the program, I think, 2 weeks ago. As most of you know, Netanyahu is involved in a very bitter fight to keep his prime minister's position. And right now, it's looking most likely that Israel will have yet a fifth set of elections this coming September. I think Netanyahu, while he has always opposed the JCPOA, had been soft pedaling his opposition late last year and early this year. And the message that was coming from Israel was no longer, it's wrong, stop it, that's all there is to it. But rather, we don't agree with it, but if you're going to go forward, do it in this way. Since the election, Netanyahu has notably toughened his language on this. And he's been criticizing the agreement in much, much harsher terms than he had been in recent months. And while, of course, he's opposed it all the way through, I think that heightened language is designed to appeal to a domestic Israeli political audience, to remind them of Netanyahu's credentials in the minds of most Israeli voters on international and security measures. So I don't think Netanyahu is any more or less opposed to the deal than he has been all along, but political circumstances in Israel have caused him to become more vocal and more forceful in his comments. I don't know that that's going to have much of an effect on Biden and his team, but as we said earlier, I'm not entirely convinced that Biden and his team are all that aggressive about actually realizing a deal anyway.
How does Russia's amassing of troops at the Ukrainian border affect Biden's approach to foreign policy in Europe and the Middle East?
Boy, this is a topic that we're going to go into more detail on next week, because although we really did want to talk about Iran this week for all the obvious reasons, the more aggressive or the more potentially aggressive steps that Russia is taking in eastern Ukraine is worth a longer conversation than we can have on it today. That said, I think whether Putin is doing it intentionally or not, he's essentially forcing those European countries who are somewhat wary of Biden to ally themselves more strongly with the United States than they might be ready to only 3 months after Donald Trump has left office. As I said earlier, Europe knows that Biden is a more traditional American politician who very strongly values the US and Europe alliance. But as I said earlier, they understand that either Donald Trump himself or another candidate with Trump-like suspicions about Europe could be in office 4 years from now. So they've been proceeding fairly cautiously. I think what Putin's been doing is reminding them of the importance of that relationship and forcing the US and Europe closer together at probably a quicker pace than they might have otherwise. I have not seen what Macron has said about this yet, but I suspect he's probably a little bit less eager to talk about independent European security measures when a Russian threat is looming at the Ukraine border than he was earlier this year.
Thank you. You explained again what you think Biden's priorities are in the world. Do you think his focus on China and limited interest in the Middle East is due to his administration feeling China is an existential challenge to the US, while the Middle East problems are not? Or do you believe Biden feels that the US simply does not have the capacity to deal with both as a high priority?
I think both. The US has a finite amount of not just military capacity and defense capacity, but of international political capital. Biden is a multilateralist. He believes that if he's going to accomplish anything on the world stage, it has to be in active cooperation with US allies. And I think while he does see China as a much greater threat to the US and to the world order than the various threats that bubble throughout the Middle East, I think the other reason he's turning in that direction is not just because of the scope of the China challenge, but because he knows he's much more likely to be able to put together a coalition to achieve a reasonable solution there. In other words, Biden has watched American presidents of both parties for almost half a century invest huge amounts of political capital in bringing peace between Israel and the Palestinians. It hasn't happened. So he's decided that since I'm probably not going to accomplish that kind of goal there, why invest a whole lot of time and effort into it when the China threat is so much greater and is so much more menacing? So I think the questioner lays out two options, both of which are true. but both geopolitical necessity and also political opportunity combined explain Biden's shift to the Pacific Rim.
This questioner is saying, in reference to your first topic, is the GOP still the party of business? Business wants infrastructure and is already talking about compromising on the Biden tax proposal to finance it. The American people want infrastructure overwhelmingly, and every state needs a lot of infrastructure. So what explains the uniform GOP position to both the infrastructure plan and paying for it?
Two things here. Number one, the US business community is very strongly in favor of dramatically enhanced investment in the nation's infrastructure. But as I said earlier, they came out very strongly just yesterday against Biden's proposal for paying for it with an increase in the corporate tax. My guess is because the corporate tax was lowered by such a large amount during the Trump tax deal in 2017, that the business community understands it's going to go up a little, but by taking such a forceful position now, they can keep it from going up any more than it has to. So they want an infrastructure deal, but they don't want to be the ones to pay for it all by themselves. And that gives Republicans an opportunity to stand up against it. If you've noticed, Republicans have been they're not arguing against infrastructure. What they're doing instead is arguing that portions of Biden's package, roads, bridges, broadband, etc., are legitimate infrastructure expenditures, but lots of other things involved in the package are not. So I think the Republicans believe that they can use the corporate tax increase as a way to continue to rebuild their relationship with the business community, and can also focus the package on a more specific set of outcomes. In other words, Republicans will see if it works or not, because it's a tricky path to walk for them. They're essentially saying, we're not against infrastructure. We're in favor of infrastructure. We're just against things that are called infrastructure, but aren't. That's me using one word, a very nebulous word, an awful lot of times in one paragraph. So I apologize for that. But something tells me we'll come back to this topic at some point in the weeks ahead, and I'll have a chance to articulate it better.
There were some very funny tweets going around on Twitter about everything being infrastructure. I don't know if you saw that or not, but there are some pretty good ones out there. So
the fact that it's becoming somewhat of a meme, that everything is infrastructure, actually does work at least a little bit and emphasize a little bit to the Republicans' advantage. I don't think either the business or the Republican Party wants to kill the package. I think they both want to narrow it and change the funding for it. We'll see if that's good enough for Biden.
This questioner says, the CDC has identified a highly contagious COVID strain as the UK variant. Should my English neighbors down the street be concerned about anti-British hate?
It's a wonderful question, and my gut instinct is that they should not. That even while we talk, I think what the questioner is very subtly referring to is the horrifying increase in hate crimes and invective that have been directed against the Asian Pacific community since the virus first came to our shores last year, and talk about the Chinese virus and the accompanying hate crimes and harassment really has been something horrible to watch. And because that's based, as the questioner I think is suggesting, not just on the source of the virus, but on long-term ethnic and racial resentments, that it's much less likely that a British variant is going to bring about the same kind of invective and anger. And if I'm reading between the lines of the questioner correctly, I think it's a very important point, and it's one that we ought to keep in mind going forward. That while it is entirely appropriate to criticize a country, China or any other, for its behavior, the importance of drawing a very stark line between the geopolitics of two nations disagreeing on a matter of public policy, drawing a very stark line between the geopolitics on one hand and the personal inter-community relationships that we need as a country to survive on the other. So very subtle question. I think I cracked the code. but it raises a really important point, and I'm very glad that it was sent in, and very glad that you selected it to share, Jessica. Thank you.
What is the rationale for reopening during the third wave when a fourth wave is anticipated, particularly because of increasing variants?
Well, I think there are two things going on here. One is a natural and understandable impatience on the part of voters. It would be very easy to attribute this to Governor Newsom's facing a recall threat and not wanting to engender too much hostility by shutting down again. But it's worth noting that Governor Whitmer in Michigan, a fellow Democrat who is not under the threat of recall, has been much more reluctant to implement a full shutdown this year like she did last year. Not just because she's trying to escape recall, but because she recognizes that the voters of her state are very fatigued and much less willing to abide by a stricter shutdown. And to a greater extent, this is the argument that Republican governors in various parts of the country, in Texas and Florida and elsewhere, are making, simply that their residents simply won't abide by it. For Newsom, the recall is a complicating factor. I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt that he would have made the decision about a June 15th reopening, whether there was a recall going on or not. But I share the questioner's concern that calling for something that dramatic, then, more than 2 months out, when there are so many unknown variables in terms of surges in other parts of the country, in terms of vaccine supply and access, I think Newsom may have acted somewhat more aggressively than he should have. And I hope that's because of his enthusiasm to get our state back to normal, as opposed to utilizing it as a means to stave off the recall.
This is a kind of a clinical question. Have people that have received both vaccine shots passed away from COVID-19? And if so, how? Supposedly people that receive both shots might get sick, but only a mild form.
Okay. Boy, this is getting a little bit over my head, and all I'll be able to offer in response is that I know that no vaccine is 100% foolproof, but that the number of illnesses, of hospitalizations, and of deaths of those who've gotten either both doses or the dose of Johnson & Johnson, the rates of hospitalization, of infection and death are much, much lower once the shots have been offered. But I can't offer a more specific answer to the question.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a kind of a complicated one. I didn't have that info. I haven't seen that info anywhere, but I'm sure there's data on it.
We know that it's much less. I just don't have the data and as to how much less.
Thank you. Do one final question. How can the RNC respond to former President Trump's call for his supporters to show their loyalty to him by sending their donations directly to him and not the RNC?
Well, the Republican National Committee really has no choice. Even though they'd rather all those small dollar donations went to the committee rather than to Trump's organization, they know that if they were to start a full public fight with Trump about it, that they'd alienate a large number of their grassroots supporters. So Ronna Romney McDaniel, the chair of the party, and Rick Scott, the head of the senatorial campaign committee, have both worked very hard to stay on good terms with Trump, because even though it means less fundraising in the short term, it doesn't hurt them nearly as much as a pronounced fight with the former president would heading into the midterms. So it's not ideal, but they suck it up and they deal with it.
I think that is taking us to the end of the hour. So again, this rushed by really quickly, but Dan, thank you again. I look forward to next week's topics, and I'll turn this back over to you and Kim.
Thanks so much, Jessica.
Great job, Jessica. Dan, another home run in help of giving us perspective and covering such a breadth of topics. So thank you so very much. I thought we'd give a pitch to your after the webinar session that we're going to in just a few minutes. For those of you who aren't aware, Dan every other week agrees to meet in a go-to-meetings format with our members, in which they can ask Dan questions directly, particularly as a follow-up for his weekly programs. If that's something you would be interested in, please consider becoming a member. It's very easy. Just go to our website and register as a member, and there's a lot of different options, and it identifies all of the benefits. So please consider becoming a member. Dan, thank you again. This was so thorough and helpful on so many levels.
Well, thank you, Kim, and thanks again to everybody for joining us. As always, we really appreciate you having us, you taking the time to be with us.
Thank you. For our viewers, as you know, we are providing these live streams for free, and our main source of revenue are from donations, and also for people who are signing up to become members. So please consider making a donation to support us so that we can keep these wonderful live streams ongoing. An easy way to do it is you just text the name Schnur to the number in the chat on your control panel. Every contribution helps so much, and we really appreciate it. We also have a terrific lineup of programs I want to quickly highlight for you. On the 15th, we have the future of U.S. engagement with international institutions and global alliances. On the 21st, California's future power grid. This is a smart, resilient, and reliable program that's sponsored by Edison and a really terrific panel of experts. And then on the 24th, we are just announcing a very special members-only film screening. It's this film Minari, and this film is nominated for 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Directing, Best Screenplay, Best Actor, Best Supporting Actress, and we're grateful for the sponsorship support from Jameson Realty and the Republic of Korea, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Consulate General in Los Angeles in presenting this wonderful film for our members. So please go to our website today, register for our programs, find out about the film. Everybody stay safe, and we hope to see you on Thursday. Dan, thank you. See you next Tuesday.
Thanks, everybody. See you next week.